we're going to look at another 3-thread option called a flat lock. To understand what the flat lock does so you can make adjustments if you're using decorative thread, we're going to thread up with 3 different colors of thread and do a test stitch. So let's go ahead and cut our threads again. And I know you're probably saying, oh no, not again. But, you know, remember you've got those really neat little features that allow you to quickly take your threads out, like your tension release. And you've got your disengaging loopers and your easy threading pass, so you're going to thread this up real quick and be a threading pro in no time at all. Alright, we've threaded up with 3 different colors of thread and we're going to do our flat lock. The flat lock tensions are set automatically on the machine, so if you don't get your flat lock automatically, what you need to look at is making sure that your thread's seated in the tension and that you have the correct stitch selected. So let's go ahead and do a test stitch. And here is what our flat lock looks like. And what flat lock was designed to do was to create a seam on active wear. So you should be able to just pull this open, and this is the back. You can see it's just kind of like a ladder stitch, and this is going to be your front. And now you have a nice joined seam, and if you put decorative thread in here, it becomes a very interesting joined seam. So now that we know that this is working, let's look at what our thread is doing. Okay, when we do the flat lock, our needle thread is what's going to pull and form the ladder stitch on the back. Our looper thread, or upper looper thread, is what's forming, you know, the decorative stitch here. And then the blue thread, which is our needle thread, is kind of what's, you know, on the side here. And if we look where our green thread is, it's actually right on the edge of the seam and helping to pull the purple thread over, or our upper looper thread. Okay, so now understanding what these threads do is going to be important, because we're going to put decorative thread in here and we're going to have to make some changes to our stitch settings. If we want to put decorative thread that shows on the seam, we have to look at the purple thread, which is our upper looper, and put the decorative thread there. If we want to do a decorative thread on the back, then we'd have to put decorative thread into the needle. So let's go ahead and let's start with a deca flat lock, and we're going to put decorative thread into our upper looper. So I'm going to go ahead and change threads and do another test stitch and put this into my swatch book, which is on your CD with your manual. And it's a good idea to keep these swatches so that you have a reference when you go to Serge, maybe in a month or two, and you want to do a decorative stitch. You can look at what the stitches are, and you can look at what your settings were for specific threads. So make sure when you do these swatches that you keep them and put them in that swatch book. Let's talk about flossing. I'm not talking about the flossing for your dental hygiene. I'm talking about the flossing for threading your serger. When you put this into the tension guide here, you're fine, you don't have to floss, but when you come down into the tension disc, you need to floss this in to make sure it seats into your tension disc, especially with decorative thread. And then you just go ahead and thread the rest of the way through. But do that for each tension disc that you thread. It's always a good idea, just floss it and make sure it seats correctly so you get the proper tension on the first try. Okay, we're threaded up now with our decorative thread in the looper, and we need to stop and think for a minute what tensions we might need to change. We want our, neon green thread in this case to pull over for the decorative stitch on the front. Our needle thread is also going to be very loose, and it pulls across the back. The tension that seems to be the tightest and the most consistent is our lower looper thread. So when you look at your settings, you are automatically in a 3-thread, so some of the settings are already there, but we're going to have to make some adjustments because of the decorative thread. So look at your tension dials, and on your first dial, I want you to change your needle dial to 0 or 1, which is the lowest you can go. On your looper dial, we're also going to move that to 1. On our lower looper dial, we're going to take this up to 6. Now let's go ahead and do a test stitch and see if that's going to give us enough of an adjustment to form our decorative stitch. And we're only using the blade as kind of a guide. We may have to move over a little bit more to form this stitch, but let's see how this goes. Okay, our stitching is pretty loose, and when we open this up and give it a little tug, it forms a stitch pretty easily. There's our stitch on the back, which is, our needle thread, and there's our decorative stitch on the front. You can see it's nice and flat, and we have, our green thread here, our decorative green thread coming across on the flat lock seam, and our needle thread on the back. Now, we do have a little bit of a seam here where it folded over, and if we want to adjust that, we would need to control where we place this on the bed of the machine, and look at the little notches or raised bumps on the actual foot. You can see there are 5 different notches or bumps, and those are representative of the 5 potential needle positions. In our case, we're set up for a wide flat lock, so we are on the second notch from the right. That's where our needle is. To make a decorative flat lock where you don't have any rolling of a seam like we do here, you're going to adjust where you feed the fabric, and bearing in mind that that second notch is where the needle's going to catch the fabric. I would try lining up with the very first notch because you want to give the fabric a little bit of room. Maybe increase your stitch width a little bit to give, the finger a little more room and a little more stitching. And do a test stitch and see if that's a good place to line up. And instead of watching the needle when you sew to keep this accurate, watch that little notch on the foot as you feed the fabric through. That'll keep you feeding the fabric evenly. And when I open this up, I get a little less of a seam, and I still get the same great decorative effect on the front. If you have too much fabric rolling in this, go ahead and move over just a little bit more towards the left until you're satisfied that you have, a lot less roll in your seam. All right, we've done a couple of our flat lock swatches, and if you stop and think for a minute, remember I said this is supposed to be a decorative seam on activewear, and if you look at some of the activewear that you've seen through the years, this should be on the other side. So when you're doing flat lock, remember, if you want the decorative stitch to be on the outside, you're going to have to put wrong sides together on your fabric and stitch this so that you get your decorative thread on top. And if you have stitches hanging off like this, this is what you should see, because you need those to be able to pull this flat. You can see there is our decorative stitch on top now, and our needle threads on the bottom. Now we're going to look at using decorative thread in the needle next, because that's another technique called a deco ladder. So here is our decorative stitch on top, and we can put this in our swatch book so that when you go through this and you want to do this in the future, you remember, oh, that's right, put the wrong sides together to get this technique. Now let's go ahead and rethread, and we're going to change our thread this way. We're going to take our decorative thread out of our looper now, and we're going to put it into our needle. And that way, now our decorative stitch is going to be this stitch right here.